Good morning, Year 10. This is another lesson on Paper 1, Question 5, continuing to look at narrative and descriptive writing. There's a little bit of change to the way in which this lesson will go. So over the last few weeks, you've had a double lesson. This week, you've almost got 3 mini lessons rather than 2 full ones. And it's going to cover 3 specific skills that writers often overlook, but can actually make or break a piece of writing. So the first mini lesson will be on It's All in the Details. So we're going to look at developing specific details in your writing and why that's important. The second session will be called Switch It Up. So we're looking at how and why changes in focus are useful and particularly effective when you're writing a story. And the third lesson is to speak or not to speak. So how to carefully craft your speech in a story, or the correct term would be dialogue. And you are expected to complete every single part of this lesson, okay, of each one. So let's get started then. So session 1, it's all in the detail. So the first thing we want you to do is think, why is it important to add detail and add depth to any descriptions that you're including in your story? So why is it important to have a detailed description of the setting? Why is it important to have a detailed description about characters or events that are going on in your story? And try and make a bit of a mind map or a list and write down all the reasons you can think of why details matter. So just pause this video, write down as many reasons as you can, and then we'll share them with your teacher in a moment. Okay, so let's have a look now why details are important. Details do take effort and obviously it takes time to plan, but are they actually really important? So let's see. So why is it important to zoom in and describe specific details? Well, details help to paint a picture with your words. So when you're writing a story, your readers can't actually see what's going on. They need to be able to imagine it in their heads. So just like a painter would paint a picture or a portrait, your writing needs colour and it needs different brush strokes, it needs different directions. Otherwise, it's going to be quite flat and two-dimensional. You want it to be believable and realistic. You want your readers to visualise what's in your head. So you need to make that clear. It might be clear to you as a writer, but unless you give them detail, they're not going to see what you want them to see. At the end of the day, they're not mind readers. You need to make it clear to them. Without detail, like I said, your writing can be flat and lifeless. Now, we're not talking about spending ounces and ounces of time writing half a page describing something in a room. But it does mean you need to take a little bit more care and give a little bit more attention and time to ensure that the picture you're trying to create is really clear. Okay, so it might just be an extra few minutes. We're not writing a full-length novel, but we do need to make sure that our details are clear. Now, the best kind of zooms or zooming in on specific details are what we call sensory details. Now, you remember this from primary school about the 5 senses, and your primary teacher will probably have said, don't forget to include every one of the 5 senses. Well, they're right, really. If you consider all of those 5 senses, your reader will be able to start feeling a little bit more immersed in your story because you've given more care and attention to the details and the things that you want your reader to experience. So it's not just all about what they can see or hear. Think about how they would feel as well, or maybe some of the aromas or stenches that might come across in the scene that you're trying to convey to them. So let's have a little bit more of a look at why details are important. You've got a video here to watch. Hopefully this will work. If not, there should be a link at the bottom on your copy of the PowerPoint. Okay, so there's a little bit of a video for you to think about why and how we can make our details a little bit more effective. Okay, so from that video, it was quite clear to see that our vocabulary is very important when it comes to providing details about characters or scenes or items within a story. Obviously, in work last week, you would have been doing work on vocabulary. So last week's work can really help you with this key aspect of a story. Now, we're going to look back at an example from a previous lesson as well. This is a section of an extract that was from your character lesson a couple of weeks ago. So I just want you to cast your eyes back over this as we read through it. And as you read through it, I want you to consider, where does the writer develop specific sensory details when they're describing this character? Okay, so Edward was far from friendly. In fact, his sneer was poisonous. To find the appropriate words to describe such a spiteful young man was difficult, to say the very least. Narrowing his snake-like eyes, he shot a look of venom at his new classmates. After shuffling uncomfortably across the prison-like classroom, he slouched his body to one side and dropped into the cheap plastic chair. The pus-filled spots on his angry face screamed to be released and resulted in whispers from his curious peers. They were like vultures ready to pounce on fresh meat. Lurking beneath the table, his size 11 feet drummed furiously on the floor and expressed a mere semblance of the irritation he felt at being moved to his ninth new school. Taking his standard biro pen from his crisp new school shirt, only the slight shake of his greasy hands revealed the feelings ranging around his hormone-fueled body. Terror. Edward was far from the brave boy he pretended to be. So now we've read through that extract, I want you to start highlighting it. So you'll be able to do this on the computer with the highlighter tool. If not, you might want to print it out, or you could just jot down some quotes. On a piece of paper, it really doesn't matter. But I want you to identify, so that means pick out every time the writer develops a description and basically look for the places they zoom into a specific detail. Once you've done that, once you've picked out all the places where they zoom into a detail, I want you to annotate every single line you've highlighted or picked out. So try to explain why each of those details helps us to add or visualize this character. How does it add to that description? How does it cause us as a reader to emotionally attach or react to this character? And jot down your notes. Make sure you either send this in to your teacher or take a picture and email it in. Okay, so here's some answers that you might have considered in that last task. So you might have looked at his sneer was poisonous. So we're not just looking at the fact that, you know, he's got a funny look on his face, he's almost looking down at people. It's the idea that it was poisonous, it was toxic. We've also got the zooming in on his eyes, the way his eyes were glaring. They were narrowing like snake's eyes. And they've also zoomed into the look. It was almost like a look of venom at his new classmates. So he's clearly, as a reader, we understand that he is not enjoying this new setting, this new school that he's going to. The writer continues this by saying he slouches into his chair and he's drumming furiously on the floor with his feet. Look at the choice of words there of slouched and drummed furiously. Those words have been chosen on purpose to zoom in to the actions of that character, to tell us and give us a clear picture of exactly what that character is doing at that point. The writer hasn't just said he sat down on a chair. They've taken a little bit more time to tell us how he sat down into that chair and what he did when he got into that chair. And it helps us to attach a bit of an emotional reaction to him. So if a character just sat down in a chair, we wouldn't really react very much to that. There's not much detail there. But by slouching, we kind of feel a little bit sorry for him. We're wondering, you know, why is he feeling this way? And then when he drums his feet furiously on the floor, we start to feel a little bit uncomfortable, just like he does in that environment. So as you can see, your choice of detail, your choice of vocabulary really impacts on how your reader feels and reacts to your character or what's going on. So the description wouldn't be the same if he'd have just tapped his feet lightly on the floor. I'm sure you can probably see that, you know, choosing your words is really important here. So here's your silver task. I want you to see if you can continue that. Can you write the next paragraph? What happens to Edward in that classroom? And try to continue with that level of detail. So you might describe the way he approaches the task that his teacher sets and how he interacts with maybe other people in that classroom. And make sure you send that paragraph into your teacher. If you really want to challenge yourself, as well as doing the silver task, so make sure you do silver first, is then move on to the gold challenge. So can you create your own opening paragraph? Can you do this from scratch? Maybe taking that picture there that you can see in the bottom right hand corner, can you use that as inspiration? And push yourself to maybe zoom into specific details into that picture. So you might imagine a couple who is ice skating on an ice rink in the distance, or you might zoom into one of the beautiful fireworks as it dances across the sky, or the movement of the trees maybe in the breeze. So make sure you share your work with us once you've done that. Okay, so this is lesson 2. Okay, so you've done your first mini lesson. This is lesson 2, which is called Time to Switch It Up. And this lesson is looking at switches or changes in focus. Now, you should have heard of this technique when we've been looking at paper 1 question 3, which is about structure. And we look at how writers structure their stories. And we often look at where writers change the focus from one thing to another. Now, being able to use this in your story yourself adds a level of sophistication to your writing, particularly if you do it very, very well. However, like it says on the screen, we need to proceed with caution. Too many changes in direction can leave your reader feeling very, very confused. So I just want you to have a look at this continuum line, this scale, from 1 through to 10. And your task is to draw this continuum line. So you can either just add your ideas directly onto the screen if you're on PowerPoint, or you might draw it out on a piece of paper or do it yourself in a Word document. It's up to you. And I want you to think about how many changes of focus, how many times do you think a writer should change the direction between one thing and another, particularly in a short story. So we're looking at a story that's maybe only a page and a half in length. How many changes of focus do you think would be appropriate for a short story? Do you think it would be quite low? Do you think you should only change the focus of a description maybe 2 or 3 times? If that's the case, explain why. Why do you think we shouldn't have that many changes in focus? Or you might be the completely opposite end of the scale. You might be thinking it's 8, 9, or 10 switches in focus. Why do you think we should have that many? Is it to keep the reader on the toes? What's your opinion? And make sure you write down and justify your ideas, please. Okay, so before we go any further, let's be really, really clear. Let's outline what exactly is a change in focus. So basically, this is where the writer of a story purposely changes or diverts the reader's attention from one thing to another. It's that simple. So let's have a look at some examples. So it might be changing our attention from a description of a setting to when a character comes in. That's a change in focus. It might be changing from one event to another. So maybe, I don't know, in your story, an alarm's gone off, and then you might change the focus to everybody running away. So that's another change in focus. You might also change from a character's thoughts inside of their head to maybe the speech that actually comes out. So maybe they don't actually say what they're thinking, maybe they tell a lie. Again, that would be classed as a change in focus. It might also change from an event or some sort of action that's taking place to a character's reaction to it. That could be both through speech, it could be, quite explicit, or it might be, again, thoughts in their heads, just how a character reacts to something that's going on. Or it might be changing to, a description of a room. You might have described the whole room in its entirety, but then you might zoom in and give a more detailed description to a specific object within it, an object that might become important in the story later on. The list is absolutely endless. There's so many things that you can change focus from one thing to another. Okay, it doesn't really matter. What does matter is, why are you changing that focus? What is the point of it? You can't just, change the focus whenever you like. So let's consider, is this actually a good technique to use? So like we did in the first task, in the first lesson, let's think of all different reasons why a change of focus could be good. Why would changing from a character's thoughts inside their head to maybe their reaction or their speech, why would that be a good idea? Just pause the tape now and list as many reasons as you can, and don't forget to send those in to your teacher so that we can see that you're following along. Okay, so now that you've considered whether it would be a good technique or not, it's sort of a little bit of a warning before we go any further, that you need to use changes in focus very, very cautiously and carefully. Now, used well, they can keep your writing from falling flat and moving too slow. Okay, it can heighten a mood, it can create tension, but it also helps you to withhold maybe bits of information and keep little bits of information secret from your reader, and not give away too much information at once. They can also direct your reader to information they might need later in the story. So, for example, when we were talking about describing a room in its entirety, and then you might change the focus to describing an object within that room, that particular object you changed the focus to might become, a focus of attention that's needed later in the story. Maybe that's the object the character is searching for all along. They just didn't realize it at the beginning. However, if you use switches or changes in focus too often, they stop you from developing detail. They make you move on too fast. And we've obviously just learned about how details are important. They add so much to your writing. So we need to make sure that we juggle these two techniques and balance them out really, really carefully. You need detail to help understand how your characters are feeling, to drive always forward those marks as well from devices and vocabulary, all those things that we get marks for. But we also need to make sure that our story isn't moving too slow, that we're not, keeping our readers held back for too long, that they get bored. We need to make sure we're diverting their attention in the right places. So how do we actually know when's the right time to switch it up? When's the right time to change direction? So let's have a look at an example. Let's see if this is a good example of how to use changes in focus. So let's see if you can find them first of all. So your bronze task is to label and highlight every time this writer purposely directs your attention to something else. So for example, if we look at it was a cold grey day in late November, we can see that it's starting off with the weather. Where does the writer then change your focus? And don't be lured into thinking it's at the beginning of the next paragraph every time. Changes in focus can come anywhere. Okay, so see if you can read through and mark off, maybe put a star or a circle, some sort of mark every time you feel that writer has changed the focus. And then the second thing I want you to do is consider why. Why does that change in focus happen at that point? And try to annotate or write down a few ideas. Again, take a picture of your work or send in your annotations to your teacher. Okay, so here's your silver task. Once you've done your annotations, look back at a story opening that you've written in a previous lesson. So it might be your character lesson that you did a few weeks ago, or even your setting work. So trawl back through your documents or through your folders or your pieces of paper that you've been keeping at home, and see if you can do the same thing again. Go back and look at your work. Identify every time you have changed the focus from one thing to another and compare it to the example that we've literally just seen in that bronze task. Think about whether your changes of focus were as effective as the ones that we've just seen in that task. Did you do it as well? Now, hopefully, you'll either say, yes, miss, mine's really, really good. I've done mine ace. And if so, then, did you realize you were doing that? Did you do it on purpose? Or did you just naturally change the focus at that point? If your answer to that question is no, I've got lots of waffle about one thing, I really should have changed the direction earlier, or you might have thought, actually, no, I've changed the direction far too many times, I've done it far too often, I need to slow down and develop my detail. So just have a look back over previous work and ask yourself and start to evaluate exactly how you did. And once you've done that, write down your evaluation. What have you learned from this task by looking back at a piece of work? What have you learned about how you change focus and what you need to do going forward? And make sure you send that in. Okay, lesson 3. This is about speech. Now, if you've getting a little bit tired, you might want to pause at this point and come back a little bit later. Like I said, there's 3 mini lessons, so you can choose to do it all in one go, or you might want to take a break. It's up to you. But this session is all about speech, or to use the correct term, dialogue. Now, lots of stories include speech. Why? What does it add? Why do writers use speech? Why do we have it at all? What is its function? What is its purpose? What does it do? So like we did, I want you to list down all the reasons why writers might use speech, like we did in the first lesson. Again, maybe a mind map or a list. Why is speech in a story? Why is it used? And your challenge there, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, is can you think of any reasons why speech or dialogue might actually ruin a story? When does it, take away from what's happening? So pause the recording now and just write down your ideas. Again, don't forget to send that in to your teacher. Okay, so there's another video here from a lovely American lady, and she's got some tips for writing strong speech. Now we'll go through and we'll maybe condense this in a little minute on the next slide, but I want you to just have a listen. Again, if the video doesn't work, there should be a link there at the bottom of your screen to take you through. Okay, so there we've got a video giving you a few tips on how to make your writing a little bit more effective when it comes to speech. Let's see if you can remember what those tips were. So here's your task. Based on what you've learnt from that video, I want you to write down 5 tips for using dialogue effectively. Now, the lady in the video did talk quite extensively about what those tips were. So try to think about what those were, write them down, and don't cheat by looking at the next slide. Okay, let's see what you got. So, tip number 1 was use speech sparingly. That means don't use it or overuse it. Don't use it too much. So, too much dialogue, too much speech can actually take away from your detail. And lesson 1 was all about why detail was really important. So, you don't want to undo all of that really hard work that you've already done by ruining it with silly, lazy speech. Tip number 2 is use it to show, not tell. Now, this is actually a really, really good technique to remember. You're not using speech to tell the reader what is going on in the story. You should describe that in your detail. You should use your narrative. You should describe that yourself. You're the writer. You should be able to paint the picture of what is going on to your readers. So we don't want to hear a conversation of between two characters of, hi Danny, hi Mel, would you like to go to that haunted house over there? Yeah, cool, that looks really spooky, come on, let's go. We don't want that sort of dialogue. It's very tedious, it's very boring, it's very simplistic, and you're not going to get marks from it. What speech should be used for is to show how your character is feeling. So when you've described the characters walking tentatively up to the haunted house, you might have one of them whisper to another about something that they've heard or something that they're feeling, or it might be, a quote from inside their head to show us how they're feeling, not tell us actually what's going on. The third tip is she said, cut the fluff. And I completely agree with that. Unnecessary speech is boring, it's pointless. You need to get rid of it. You need to make sure that you're using speech when it's important. So this links to point number 1. You're using it sparingly. So don't waste it on pointless speech. Make sure whatever your character is saying is important. Number 4, use it to complement pace. Now, what we mean by that is the more speech you have in quite quick succession. So if you have quite a large chunk of speech, it can actually read quite quickly. So it increases the pace. So if you've got quite a thrilling scene that's exciting, you might actually have characters talk quite quickly to one another in quick succession. But if speech is spread out and is interspersed between descriptions of what's going on or how characters are reacting, that speech can read a little bit more slowly. And sometimes it can create tension or even calm. So you also need to describe where you place your speech to make sure you create the right sort of pace that matches the atmosphere that you're trying to create. So as you can see, that's quite a complex thing to do. And if you do it well, you're only going to score good marks from the examiners. And lastly, number 5 is make speech interesting and purposeful. And this sort of, links to number 3 really. Characters can say interesting things. They have to say important things. You shouldn't be using speech to just fill up part of a page to make it look like you've written more than what you have. Whatever speech a character says should add to the drama. And provide details and emotion to what's going on. It should only add to your scene, not take away from it. So bear that in mind when we're moving on. So look at this silver resilience task now. I want you to look at this extract, okay? And you'll notice that there's absolutely no speech in this extract at all. It's pure description, it's pure narrative. Your job is to add some speech in. You need to choose where that speech goes, who's going to say it, what are they going to say, and look back at those 5 rules. Make sure we're using it sparingly. It's to show, not tell. Make sure that you know, the speech is purposeful and to complement the pace of this extract already. So read it first, okay, and then think to yourself, right, how am I going to add speech into it? Now you'll notice the little yellow square in the bottom right hand corner. If you're stuck, think about Diggs the policeman. Think about the policeman, what he might want to say, what would he say to make sure he gains entry to the house at that point. But remember, it's not going to be something like, "Hi, let me in." It needs to be something interesting. So how are you going to hook the reader on knowing why that policeman is there? How can it create a little bit of mystery? Okay, so you can either do that on the computer or you might write it down on paper, but either way, don't forget to send it in. Okay, and lastly, for those of you who really want to challenge yourself with your final task, is again, look back at an opening to a story that you've written. You might use the same one as we did in our mini lesson 2, or you might pick a completely different one. And in the same way that we evaluated how we used change of focus in our previous writing, I want you to see if you've included any speech in a story that you've written so far. So look at something you've already sent in. Did you have speech in it? If you didn't, again, try and challenge yourself. Would it add to your scene? Would you consider using speech at any point? Okay. If it already contains speech, can you modify it to make sure it fits in with those 5 top tips to make sure that your speech, the way you've used it, is effective and it's crafted on purpose. It's for effect, it's doing a job, it has a purpose. It's not just to fill a gap and to look like space on the page. Make sure you send us in your improved paragraph. So we want to see where you've added speech in or you've had an evaluation of speech that you've already used. Okay. Now, hopefully this has been useful for you. I hope you're all staying very well, and hopefully you'll join me next week for our last lesson on narrative and descriptive writing. Stay safe all.